Zach Osterman from Indy Star stopping by. Of course, Indiana, the ladies. First of all, talk about the ladies. I know that's not your beat per se, but the women are just rolling. Big game last night as the Ohio State Buckeyes, current number 2. Of course, that's going to change after the poll comes out after losing back-to-back games to Iowa and Indiana. But huge game for Indiana, huge win for Indiana. Terry Moore has that squad. They are continuing to roll. Greatest season probably ever in women's basketball history.
Yeah, I mean certainly the best start. Obviously they've played a Big Ten championship game. They've played in an Elite Eight, so this team's got a ways to go to kind of match it in March. But I think there's obviously, I think people have talked about this, that Indiana lost obviously some longtime pieces last year: Ali Patberg, Nicole Cardano, Hillary, Alexa Goulbe, etc. And to kind of bounce back a couple of really impact transfers, a really good freshman. It's a credit to kind of just the consistency, I guess, of the culture, for lack of a better term, that Terry Moore has built. But I think if you also just look at this team, I mean, Chloe Moore McNeil and Grace Berger are both really good, tough ball handlers. Sydney Parrish gives you length and some toughness. Not that Indiana wasn't tough last year, but when you've got somebody that I think will she's got a great shot, but she'll also scrap for rebounds, for steals, for loose balls. And when you've got somebody who will do that and also give you the length she gives you, that makes a real difference to the way you can defend opponents and the mismatches you can create. I mean, Yarden Garzon, I'm going to be honest, like, she's tracking toward Big Ten Freshman of the Year. I think this guy may be the limit for her. She looks outstanding.
It's incredible.
And I mean, like, it's also kind of one of those too where, I mean, she was great last night, 20 points, 10 rebounds, 3 assists. She hit 3 threes in 3 straight possessions in that third quarter where Indiana was plus 21 and pulled away. But it's one of those too. I remember thinking this about Carson Edwards when he was at Purdue. He wasn't scoring a ton of points when he was young because he didn't need to. Purdue had older players, but you saw him and you just thought, that is a kid who's going to be really, really good. Once he grows into his game a little bit more, once his team needs him to be a little bit more of a ball-dominant player, he is going to be a difference maker. And that is what Garzon looks like to me. And she's got the 3-point shot. She can rebound. She's got good defensive instincts. Again, you're talking about somebody who brings length and can create physical mismatches. She can be very good. And then, of course, Mackenzie Holmes is just playing at an All-American level right now. 26 points and 4 rebounds last night. 11 of 13 from the floor. She eventually fouled out long after the game was decided, in about the last 30, 35 seconds.
How did she only end up with 4 rebounds is the most amazing stat to me.
Well, and on a night where there were plenty of rebounds to go around, but Sydney Parrish and Yarden Garzon combined for 21. I mean, and again, that goes back a little bit to this idea that Indiana's got length and size that can sneak up on you, because, you tend to think about length as, your 4 or your 5, but both of those players really can play more like a 3, Parrish and Garzon. And so you don't, maybe, at first blush, you don't think that they're going to crash the board so well. But I mean, Sydney Parrish was in foul trouble most of last night. She played 32 minutes. She had a double-double. Garzon had a double-double as well. I think there are ways that this group, it's not maybe as experienced in terms of the time it's had together as last year was, because that team had 2 or 3 years of kind of uninterrupted success as a group. But this team, I think, can be a bit more of a mismatch problem when you start getting into, obviously, matchups like last night, or when you play Iowa or Maryland. Certainly once you get into the tournament and you've got to, you get past maybe the opponents you're expected to beat, and you start getting into like the UConns or the South Carolinas or whatever. You think about the Tennessee game earlier this season. This team can really match you up in some difficult ways to defend.
And the Indiana men's program coming around, obviously having a getting back to having the type of season that the fans wanted to see them have, along with this women's program, which has coming on a number of years now, where they are sustaining their growth. If the men and men's and women's program can continuously be good at the same time, Indiana could potentially really be a juggernaut in that sport because of obvious the history, the legacy of basketball in this state, at that school at Indiana University. But it has never been that way for the women, and being able to really parlay that on to the Indiana, the basketball and all that. And the coaching job that Terry Morin is doing, the success they're having, they could really turn that into a juggernaut of a program.
I mean, I wrote this last night. Notre Dame, Purdue, Louisville, to some extent Kentucky, obviously Ohio State. So many of the Power Five or high major, whatever term you want to use, programs in this area have been really, really good at women's basketball at one time or another in just the last 30 years. I mean, Purdue was one of the best teams one of the best programs in the country in the '90s and early 2000s. Notre Dame speaks for itself. Louisville has been really good under Jeff Walls. Ohio State's been good under multiple head coaches, and obviously the Big Ten, it goes without saying, will support programs at that level. Big Ten programs are constantly in and around the top 15, the top 10, etc. Indiana had never found a way to kind of get that going, and it's possible that how many of those programs, and this is true in basically any college sport, how many of those programs can coexist alongside one another at an elite level will always be kind of a difficult question to answer. But it feels like it's Indiana's turn now, and to your point about the men, if the men can kind of rise up and match that, I mean, the only, I was thinking about it while you were talking there, the only comparison that comes to mind, and if we sat here and racked our brains, we could think of a few more, but the only comparison that comes immediately to mind would have been early mid 2000s UConn, late 90s to mid 2000s UConn, when Jim Calhoun was winning national titles on the men's side, and Gina Auriemma, of course, was building and then sustaining an absolute superpower on the women's side. I think, listen, this is a fan base that I think would absolutely embrace that. Last night was genuinely as loud as I've heard Assembly Hall, and it was only the lower bowl, but in some ways, I think that almost made it louder because there was more empty space for the sound to bounce into and out of, and back to the floor. And I started my sports writing career, such as it is, covering IU women's basketball for the Indiana Daily Student in the fall of 2007, and I talked to Jeremy Gray, who's an associate athletic director at IU, about this. At the time, he was the women's basketball play-by-play voice, and that was where I met him. And we would sit on press row, and I mean, they would be lucky to fill the bleachers immediately around the court, and then maybe get kind of a small hump of people in sort of the premium seats around mid-court up in the lower bowl. That was, if they got 1,000 people in the building, that was a good night. Last night they had 10,000, and start to finish, nobody acted like it was. Everyone appreciated it, but no one acted like it was unexpected. No one acted like it was a big deal, in the sense that everyone kind of knew they were going to get a big crowd. It was going to be raucous, and they were going to win the game. And what was remarkable about it, and this was kind of the hook of what I wrote last night, was what was remarkable about it was that it's not remarkable anymore. That here in Terry Morin's 9th year, this is just what Indiana women's basketball is. And I think if you look again at what Terry's been able to do, certainly in terms of building her rosters and that, etc., and then you look at the historical nature of what Notre Dame has been able to do in the sport, what Purdue has been able to do in the sport, what Louisville's been able to do in the sport, you say there's no reason that Indiana can't sustain this. There's no reason that Indiana cannot, make this something that lasts.
I agree absolutely, and looking forward to that because we're probably going to see at least two more home games that potentially might break that record. Purdue, when Purdue comes down to play, and of course when Caitlin Clark in Iowa comes in, that will be just an absolute big time game for all of college basketball to be paying attention to. And I'm not talking about just women's basketball. I'm talking about on either side. That's going to be a big time game on TV for people to watch, and deservedly so, with what Iowa has accomplished and with what this Indiana team has accomplished.
And I think, we can spin this out a thousand different ways, but I think about Caitlin Clark. I think about, the way that she has used, I think, the NIL space to really grow exposure for women's basketball in the last couple of years. I think about the value of players like that and players like Mackenzie Holmes and Grace Berger staying in college and strengthening the college game. And it's obviously a different dynamic between, on the women's side versus the men's side, college versus pro and all that. But no, I mean, it is, it's great for the women's game. And at the same time, again, it's also something that 2 or 3 years ago, you would have said, "Wow, look where IU basketball is. Look at the company that they're keeping." Caitlin Clark is one of the most remarkable basketball players we've seen in the last 5 to 10 years. Ohio State, Kevin McGuff has turned Ohio State back into a powerhouse and all this. Look at the company they're keeping. Well, now you just kind of look around and you say, like, well, yeah, that this is Indiana has made this conversation as much as it has. Join the conversation. In some ways, it has made the conversation. And you just, like I said, I do sometimes shake my head at it because I would not have, and baseball went through a similar transition, about 10 years ago. And it's funny because I covered women's basketball and baseball back to back that academic year, 0708. And it was kind of the same thing. I remember standing with Tracy Smith and laughing about all the quirky little, terrible things that were wrong with Simbauer. And there were 400 people in the stands, and people were bringing their own, Taco Bell, and there was one working bathroom and all this kind of stuff. And then, within 5 or 6 years, you're getting 4,000 people showing up. Indiana's beating top 10 teams. Indiana's winning regionals. Indiana's going to Omaha. This is what can happen if you get the right people in the right places and you empower them. And I mean, the job Terry Morin has done building that program and building it, in a consistent way. It's always been, she has had a real, she has found a formula that works really well for her in terms of the balance of high school recruits that develop within the program, when to seek out transfers, how to identify transfers that will fit her program, her system, her style, her personality, how to integrate, transfers, because we talked so much in the last few years about the growth of the portal and how do you get the portal right and all that kind of stuff. The ability to put transfers in positions to be immediately successful. It's a formula that has worked so consistently for her that that there's no reason to think it won't continue to.
Absolutely. The men, of course, also playing Ohio State this weekend in another important game, where every game is important in the conference for the Hoosiers, as they have a home game after winning a tight one on the road in Minnesota. I know a lot of fans got a little upset about that, but to me, and I keep using the phrase, it was an Al Davis game to me. Just win, baby. Get on the plane, get home. Don't worry about that one and put that away. Now they've got an Ohio State team coming in that's lost 6 of 7, but is still a good enough team that you have to worry about them. They're dangerous because they've lost 6 of 7. They've been hit with some injuries as well here and there. But Indiana this is another game and an opportunity to win 5 Big Ten games in a row, something they haven't done since, I think, 2016, the last Big Ten championship season they had. So this is a chance for them to continue to put some things behind them.
Yeah, Ohio State's a funny team. It's just kind of hard to figure Ohio State out. I mean, they've lost 6 of 7. The one win was kind of this really impressive performance at home against Iowa, and then they turn around and trip against Illinois too. It's also worth saying this is their fourth road game in 5. So they're probably feeling just a little bit road weary at this point too. But they've beaten Rutgers, they've beaten Cincinnati, they've beaten Iowa, they've beaten Northwestern, which right now is actually something worth kind of bragging about based on where Northwestern is. And the metrics have held up. They can score the ball really well. The net still likes them. I think this would still be a quad 1 win, at least for the moment, for Indiana. They're 20 or so in Ken Palm. I think that, I understand people who got very nervous during the Maryland or the Minnesota game. You're allowed to lose a game you're allowed to win a game the way you won the Minnesota game, so long as you turn around and beat Ohio State. Every season's going to have games like Minnesota. Particularly, I mean, that was a particularly strange game. Indiana didn't have its head coach. Minnesota didn't have its leading scorer. Minnesota kind of ripped up its normal game plan and went to something completely different that it took Indiana a while to figure out. I think it is worth saying Indiana still, Indiana kind of, the reasons why Indiana won that game were, one, Indiana held tightly to its ability to defend. Minnesota did, averaged a little under 0.9 points per possession in that game, didn't score in the last 320, missed its last 11 shots. And Indiana had far and away the best player on the floor. And, I think about some of the games that Indiana has come up short in the last 2 or 3 years. Often what we said was Indiana put themselves in a position to win, but they couldn't dig in and make the winning plays when it mattered, and the other team just had somebody better. Thinking about the Rutgers loss at home last year, the Wisconsin loss at home last year when Johnny Davis just took over late. You're allowed to have games like that so long as they don't become a habit. And if Indiana turns around and wins tomorrow night at home against Ohio State, then Minnesota is a distant memory. It's just, is just a as you said, just sort of tick the box and move on game and nothing more. And it doesn't, given the circumstances surrounding the game, it does feel more than likely it was just a one-off bad performance and not a sign of things to come. But we'll see. Obviously, I mean, this is a big stretch, I think, for Indiana. Ohio State at Maryland, Purdue, Rutgers. After that, you play 4 of 5 on the road. You've got to make hay while the sun is shining here. You're playing well. You're starting to get healthy again. Trace Jackson Davis is on a tear like we haven't seen in years from an Indiana player. You've got to find a way to really gather some success, gather some quality wins, get yourself well above 500 in conference play, and that'll allow you some wiggle room to navigate that stretch where you do play 4 or 5 on the road. I know there are people asking about, can Indiana get back into the Big Ten title conversation? I think that's probably too far away for anybody to think about right now. I think all you can think about if you're Indiana is control what you can control, and if you really want to think big enough picture about the Big Ten title, you got to beat Purdue twice. You got to win out at home. Neither of those things is going to be easy. So just sort of set the Big Ten championship race to one side and just worry about just keep winning, just keep pushing yourself up the standings, putting yourself in a better position for the Big Ten tournament, adding quality wins for your March resume, for your NCAA tournament resume. And this is the kind of game where you do that. It's an opponent that's a little tricky in some ways. It's an opponent that has had a funny season, but can still definitely beat you if you don't play well. But it's also a Saturday night at home. You've won 4 in a row. Your crowd should have all day. The weather's not going to be terrible. Your crowd should have all day to plan around the game, to get up for the game, to get in the building for the game. And it's the kind of game that if you want to be a top 4 team in the league, if you want to, let's say, finish 12-8, 13-7, and just have the kind of season where on Selection Sunday you're a 4 seed, a 5 seed, you're comfortable. This is the kind of game that you win without a ton of headache. You just find a way.
We're not quite at the halfway point, but pretty close. Bryce Sensabaugh has pretty much, I'm not going to say sewn up because nothing is sewn up, but he has looked like the Big Ten freshman of the year So far, he's have just really been a key player. Not that other freshmen haven't been keys at Purdue and Indiana, but he has really kind of stood out as a freshman. More so, Jalen Hutchefino is done well. Has struggled some with the shooting here and there, but he's been a constant for Indiana. Of course, Braden Smith and Fletcher Lawyer at Purdue. But Bryce Sensabaugh has kind of stood out in that category as freshman of the year for Ohio State and has done a hell of a job for them this year.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably fair to install him as the front runner. And as you said, there's time left. And Jalen Hood-Schifino and both the guards at Purdue, I think, could have something to say about that race in the second half of the season. But if you look at Sensabaugh's numbers, he's the biggest threat. He's 6'6". I mean, this was the kind of player Indiana struggled to defend last season. And I thought that despite him scoring 26 points, I thought Indiana did some really important things on Terrence Shannon in that win at Illinois that maybe we didn't see them do, against a Johnny Davis or against a Keegan Murray consistently enough last year in terms of taking him out of the game when it was most important to. Bryce Sensabaugh is going to test that too. 6'6", 235. He's averaging 17.4 points and 5.5 rebounds. He's shooting almost 46% or 43% from three. I mean, this is a guy that if you just look at just look at the games he's put together. I mean, since the Big Ten restart, it's 18 points, 21 points, 22 points, 18 points, 20 points, 18 points, 27 points, only 14 on 13 shots in the loss at Illinois. But even when Ohio State has played poorly, or at least has not won, Sensabaugh still played well. And that Iowa game last Saturday, 27 points in 27 minutes, 10 of 12 from the floor, 5 rebounds, 4 of 5 from three. He is going to stress Indiana's defense, and he is the player that opens a lot of things up for, other players on that team like Justice Suing and Zed Key and Bruce Thornton and Sean McNeil, who's a really good shooter. Indiana's got to, at very least, find a way to isolate Bryce Sensabaugh within the offense. That's what I think they did a good job of with Terrence Shannon. Shannon got his points, but you never felt like the game was running through him, and you never felt like he was in control of it. Certainly not in the moments when the game was sort of most in the balance in that game at Illinois. You've got to find a way to sort of isolate Sensabaugh too, and accept that, hey, he's going to score some points. You're not going to hold him to 5 points on 11 shots, but make sure that when he's scoring his points, they're coming in compartments of the game where you're in control, and all he's really doing is keeping Ohio State from getting, kind of completely shoved out the door.
And then, of course, now a race that has changed, at least in my mind, is the race for Player of the Year. Zach Edey, of course, on the number one team in the country, the number one team in the conference, Purdue, and only lost once, and he has played constant throughout the entire season. You cannot take that away. And where Trace Jackson Davis did have a lull, Indiana had a lull. People can blame it on his back or not. I don't care. There were times where I don't think he played like he should have played, period. But he's playing at a level above anything I've seen Zach Edey do. Hell, he's playing at a level above we've seen anybody do in 25 or 30 years from certain statistics. And to me, he's equaled that race. And to me, this is a dead heat from here out. Of course, they play against each other twice, and that will go a long way in settling that debate. But in my mind, and I consider myself as unbiased as anybody, I think this is Zach Edey is not in front of this race in my mind personally anymore.
No, I think that's fair. I mean, I keep an eye on the Ken Palm. Ken Palm always kind of has like a first team all conference for every conference. And right now, Zach Edey, and he ranks it. Zach Edey's 1, Trace Jackson Davis is 2, Jalen Pickett's 3, Terrence Shannon's 4, Jameer Young's 5. I think Sensabaugh had been kind of 5th. I think Jameer Young kind of knocked him out, the guard from Maryland. So Sensabaugh's in that range. If you're asking me to kind of put those players into tiers, I think Shannon, Sensabaugh, and Young are all on one level. Pickett's on a level above them, at least for the moment. And Jackson Davis and Edey are on a level above him. As you said, there's a lot of basketball to be played, and the two meetings between these two teams will probably play a big role in kind of people's perception, media's perception, the conference's perception of the race between the two of them. This is one of these things that kind of happens too a little bit sometimes is, sort of like, how do you weight team success and individual success? I remember I was the only person who voted for Yogi Ferrell over Denzel Valentine for Big Ten Player of the Year in 2016, and Valentine was outstanding that season. He had multiple triple doubles. He led the conference in a couple key defensive or offensive categories. He was one of the best players, one of the best all around guards the league has seen in 10, 15 years. And my argument was basically just that Yogi Ferrell won the Big Ten, and he had a season that, for a point guard, in many ways equaled what Denzel Valentine did. Maybe not in every way, but without Yogi Ferrell, Indiana doesn't come anywhere near the Big Ten title. So then you kind of have this conversation about, well, Trace Jackson Davis sort of resuscitated Indiana's season. Without him, where would Indiana be? On the other hand, it's, Zach Edey is what makes Purdue a matchup nightmare. How do you separate those two? Edey is, I think Jackson Davis has been scoring a little bit more recently. As you said, Edey's been more consistent with the scoring and the rebounding across the course of the season. On the other hand, Jackson Davis has been better at rim protection, and he's starting to become a real facilitator as well. He's like top 15 in the conference in assists, and he's one of only two bigs in the conference that can say they're top 5 in scoring, rebounding, and blocks, and top 15 in assists. In fact, he might be the only big that can say that specifically. So, there's a lot of basketball to be played, and there's a real chance that race just kind of clarifies itself by somebody gets hurt or somebody's team really falls off or whatever. But right now, I do think what felt like it was kind of a clear sort of Zach Edey coronation. I would say coronation, but it felt clear that was Zach Edey's to lose for a while this season. I think Trace Jackson Davis has succeeded at this point in making it a two player race.